I think there's one important question we all have to ask ourselves regarding the A's. How did they get into this mess?
You are Locked On A's, your daily Oakland A's podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, A's fans, and welcome to Locked On A's, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day, especially if it's the A's. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully. I am also the host of the Locked On MLB podcast, which I've been doing now for 6 years. So you'll forgive me if every once in a while I slip into that intro as I'm doing 2 shows every single day. Follow us at Locked On A's on Twitter or whatever it's called now, and on Instagram. And I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, which is what I call it, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. And if you are indeed listening to our show every single day and you want to post on any of our social media sites, make sure to use that hashtag EverydayA's so we get a sense of who's listening to us every single day. Believe it or not, that helps out. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So we all know the A's are in a pickle. I'm not talking about the series with Houston or anything. I'm going to take a step back from just covering the games for a second, because I was thinking about this. I thought about this when I was going to the game in Oakland a couple of weekends ago, and I've been thinking about this a lot as I've been reading a lot about the A's history and trying to understand how we got here, how we got to the point where they're playing in a crumbling stadium, where they're going to leave the ballpark despite any claims to be rooted in Oakland. And they don't really have a plan moving forward. They don't. They don't know if they're going to be playing in Sacramento for 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. There is no plan in Las Vegas. There's no way anyone could look me in the eye and say they have a plan when they don't know where they're going to build a stadium. They don't know what the stadium they're going to build is going to be, and they don't have the money to build it. Those are 3 minor details in building a stadium. And so they're going to be sharing a ballpark with a minor league team. Now, reading about the history of the A's going all the way back to Connie Mack, through their tumultuous time in Kansas City, through Charlie O'Finley, up through the Moneyball days, through today, the A's history has been pockmarked with great bursts, but then almost as quickly the tearing down of terrific teams. And it seems to be kind of the curse of this team. And maybe Las Vegas should think twice about opening their doors, although I think Sacramento may be open to them. How did we get here? And let me explain to you where here is. When my family moved to Northern California, it was the mid-1980s. And right around then, the A's and the Giants had a renaissance. In fact, they met in the World Series in 1989. But of the 2 teams, the A's were the glamorous franchise. The A's were the powerful franchise. And not just because the A's kicked the Giants left and right in one of the single least competitive World Series played in the history of baseball. And, of course, World Series that mainly people remember for the earthquake that took place in the middle of it. I was a senior in high school when that happened, living in the San Francisco Bay Area, watching the 2 local teams play. The Giants were the clear underdog in so many ways. They had the lower payroll, they had the fewer stars, but also their stadium situation was a disaster. Candlestick Park sucked. I don't care what nostalgia you have for it. Remember, people are going to be nostalgic for the Oakland Coliseum, but it was a terrible stadium. They had a hard time drawing. It was cold. There was always nasty traffic afterwards. It was in a bad location. There was no public transportation that went there, and it was a mess. And the Giants had been trying to get out of there basically since 1977, when they came this close to becoming the Toronto Giants. They needed a new ballpark, and they were trying to get public money to build a new ballpark in the China Basin area, and it was going to be on the ballot in 1989 in November. And with the Giants winning the pennant that year, there was a lot of momentum. towards maybe they're going to have a new ballpark. The earthquake hit, people's priorities were set straight, and the Giants lost their ballpark initiative, and it looked like they were going to leave town. And with that, the A's, who were drawing 2.something million fans since they got very good again. In '89, when they won the World Series, they drew 2.6 million. The next year, they nearly drew 3 million. The Giants weren't drawing numbers like that. The A's had superstars: Canseco, McGuire, Dennis Eckersley, Ricky Henderson, Dave Stewart, Bob Welch, Carney Lansford, Terry Steinbach. It was a star-studded team. Hall of Famer Harold Baines and batting champion Willie McGee were role players on this team. And the Giants were on the way out. The A's were the glamorous franchise with a solid owner, a deep farm system, and it looked like was soon going to have the Bay to themselves. That was 1991, 1992. And here we are, 30 some odd years later. It's the Giants region, and the A's don't know where the hell they are. What happened? Now, the fans didn't show up. No. What happened? Something seismic happened, which may be the wrong description to use when you consider what happened in the 1989 World Series. But still, a bunch of things happened. And they all happened in a way that none of them seemed to be that significant when they happened, except when you add them all together, the sum total was a disaster for the Oakland A's. So let's start with the apex. The A's win the World Series and look like they're going to win pennants in perpetuity. They're a glamorous team who can now sign some of their stars to long-term deals. Ricky Henderson signed a long-term deal. I mean, these are all relative long-term deals, but Ricky Henderson signed a long-term deal. Dennis Eckersley signed a long-term deal. Jose Canseco signed a long-term deal. Dave Stewart signed a long-term deal. They kept their stars together so you can get attached to those players. And it looked like the Haas family was going to be the owners that the A's needed ever since Connie Mack got senile in Philadelphia. They had a local owner. This wasn't an interloper from Chicago like Charlie Finley was. This is someone whose roots were in Levi Strauss and the gold rush. They were rooted in the Bay Area. We're keeping them in the Bay Area. Prevented the A's from leaving for Denver after the 1980 season, or before the 1980 season, when they bought the team from Charlie O'Finley. And while it took a little bit, they went through the Billy Ball experiment. They went through a little bit, and their attendance wasn't great, and the A's fans were suspicious, especially when they first traded away Ricky Henderson to New York. By the time they put a winner on the field with local heroes like Stewart and the reacquired Henderson and Tony La Russa, who's the smartest man in baseball, just ask him, and Sandy Alderson putting the team together, and a robust farm system that produced 3 straight rookies of the year, and being able to take reclamation projects from the Dodgers like Rick Honeycutt, Dave Stewart, Bob Welch, and turn Dennis Eckersley from a washed-up starter to a Hall of Fame reliever. They were the ideal team. What happened? Well, the Haas family was doing a wonderful job, mainly because Walter A. Haas loved the team, put his money into the team, and reaped the rewards. But the Haas family made a critical mistake that was so easily corrected or reversed in the years since, and for reasons that I don't understand, never was. As the Giants were looking for an alternative to build a ballpark, after San Francisco said no for public funding of a China Basin ballpark, and Candlestick was not viable, they looked to the South Bay, specifically to San Jose, to build a potential ballpark. San Jose was the largest city in the Bay Area in terms of population, and it's kind of a midway point, kind of a hub, kind of a center where the Bay goes into the South Bay And it's easily accessible from San Francisco and Oakland. But you also get the peninsula, you get Silicon Valley, you get the South Bay, and it's not too far from Santa Cruz. It is, in many ways, would have been an ideal spot to put a major league ballpark. And there's a lot of land to do it. And the Walter Haas made a decision. Now, either he made this decision pragmatically to try to give the Giants a hand so that they could share the bay together, or whether it was an attempt to be Machiavellian and have the Giants leave San Francisco. The A's suddenly are able to siphon fans from San Francisco, knowing San Jose probably wouldn't approve a stadium and would eventually lead the Giants elsewhere. The A's gave territorial rights to San Jose to the Giants. Now, no other market with multiple teams, Los Angeles, kind of, Chicago and New York, they don't carve up regions for territorial rights. And at the time, the A's didn't own that territorial rights. It was shared by the Giants and the A's. And the A's said, that's yours. Go. Be free. For nothing. That decision was one of the few bad ones made by Walter Haas and the Haas family. And it came back to haunt the A's for literally decades. And if there was an actual commissioner of baseball, it could have been solved and reversed. And the A's would probably be playing in the Bay Area in perpetuity. Maybe not in the East Bay, but there you go. But that was the first thing that went wrong. But a couple other things went wrong, kind of one right after another. And the result was, well, let's be honest. We see what the result is, and it's not pretty. Hey, let's talk a little bit about our friends over at Game Time. Do you use Game Time? Game Time is the ideal app that you need to use to get tickets. Now, A's fans, is it hard to get tickets? Okay, maybe it's not in Oakland. But if you want to see Sharks games, you want to see the Giants games, you want to see Niner games, you want to see the best of any sporting event, what you need to go do is check out Game Time. They got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices and views from the seats. If you are going to the A's game, wouldn't you want to have control of where you're sitting? Am I sitting in the right section? Is there something blocking me? Well, I like the view of that better than the other. They get the lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying your tickets. Now, you get last-minute tickets, you get flash deals, you get zone deals where you say, I want this general area, and they find you the best bargains there. They're easy to find Major League Baseball tickets and for every kind of event in your area. And you get the lowest price guarantee and event cancellation protection, job loss protection, you name it. All-in prices. You use the all-in price. You don't have any hidden fees in there. The price is what you get. And your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying your tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONMLB. Locked On MLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. And redeem code Locked On MLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices. Do you know what they are? I'll tell you what they are. They're guaranteed. Hey, where's your hub for all of your sports news? Where do you go to for the latest coverage, for the latest takes, for the latest opinions, and the scores and all the info that you need? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day from the good folks at the Locked On Podcast Network. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channel app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Another thing happened shortly after the A's won the World Series in 1989. Several players wound up leaving the A's via free agency. Storm Davis, Dave Parker, a couple players that allowed the A's to get some additional draft picks. And with that, the A's, the defending World Series champion, saw a chance to replenish and stock the farm system with a bunch of terrific prospects. They had, before the second round arrived, the defending World Series champions were going to pick 4 times. 4 times. And in that draft, they saw an opportunity to get 4 excellent prospects into their system. And they had an eye towards college pitchers with the mentality that they were already a few steps along the way of the development process. And if they could add them in with a rotation that was solid, obviously Dave Stewart, Bob Welch, Mike Moore, and the newly acquired Scott Sanderson were all fine pitchers, but none of them were exactly spring chickens. If they could replenish their farm with a bunch of good, solid pitchers, they could develop a great rotation while still winning World Series. Their first pick was the 14th pick overall. Now, Todd Van Poppel was the best pitching prospect in baseball. He was a high school pitcher who was committed to go to the University of Texas. And he would have been the number 1 pick overall if he didn't already make that commitment, which is one reason why the Braves, the Tigers, the Phillies, the White Sox, the Pirates, the Mariners, the Reds, the Indians, the Dodgers, the Yankees, the Expos, the Twins, the Cardinals, all passed on him. Because they said, what's the point of drafting him? He's not going to sign. The A's were at number 14 because the Milwaukee Brewers signed Dave Parker, and that was part of their compensation. And they said, well, we got 4 picks in the draft, which means we're going to probably bring in 3 college pitchers. Why don't we draft Van Poppel? And just as a little Hail Mary. And if it doesn't work, fine, we'll take 3 college pitchers. But if it works, we could get a legit ace. Now, Boris, his agent, saw this as an opportunity to say, hey, why don't we just rake the A's over the coals? Because he's probably going to college anyway. We'll make an outrageous contract offer or a demand. And one of them was he could not be sent down to the minor leagues after a certain number of innings pitched. So it was a way to keep him artificially in the major leagues, to get him there as quick as possible. And the A's bit. And they drafted Van Poppel. And some people said it was unfair, especially the Braves, who needed legitimate stars in their terrible farm system. And they were stuck signing the incredibly inferior talent of Chipper Jones with the number 1 pick when they could have had Todd Van Poppel. Well, they had 3 other picks. They picked, after Van Poppel, they picked Don Peters, a college pitcher from the University of St. Francis. They drafted Dave Zanicaro from UCLA and Kirk Dressendorfer from the University of Texas. And they were called the 4 Aces. And with that, the A's were going to have a dynamite rotation from here on forward. Here's the problem. The contract that artificially kept Van Poppel in the major leagues made sure he was up in the major leagues and not be allowed to be sent back down when he wasn't ready. And he wound up just being bombed out. He was terrible, and he had the talent. He just should have either been in the University of Texas or in the minor leagues till he was ready, instead of being rushed up as per the instructions of his contract. He bounced around a bunch of organizations and ultimately became an okay middle reliever for the Pirates, but he was never the ace that anyone thought. But of all the ones they drafted, he was by far the biggest success. Don Peters never made it to the major leagues. Dave Zanicaro never made it to the major leagues. Kirk Dressendorfer played only a handful of games in the major leagues. And who could they have drafted instead? Who was available in that draft? If their strategy was to draft college pitchers, Mike Mussina, who pitched for Stanford right across the bay, was available to be drafted. He was drafted by Baltimore. They got a Hall of Famer. And the bust of the 1990 draft came back to haunt them as well. But Walter Haas did something else. And it's something that is hard to reverse, and they never have reversed it. And with the thing that he did, the A's, quite frankly, never, ever recovered. And it's going to sound harsh, but it's true. And it's something, once I tell you what it was, you'll deny it. There's no reversing it. Let's talk a little bit to our friends at FanDuel. Do you know what FanDuel is? Are you going to FanDuel? It is winner take all time for the NBA championship and for the Stanley Cup playoffs. And FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, it's America's #1 sportsbook. Hey, here's a reminder that Locked On has begun the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's available on the Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channel app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local extras of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channel app. Well, the A's remained a solid team. They lost the World Series in 1990, but again, we're still elite. And while missing the playoffs in 1991, they still drew 2.7 million. In 1992, they were back in the playoffs, and they drew nearly 2.5 million fans. They had 2.49 million fans, nearly 2.5 million. They were continuing to draw very well. In 1993, the A's fortunes fell off a cliff, and they went from 96 wins to 94 losses. They still drew 2 million fans, however, which is more than they ever drew when they were winning the World Series. Now, they needed to rebuild the team, and A's fans were probably a little wary of that. But another thing happened in 1994. The strike hit, and the strike hit baseball hard. The A's were not very competitive the year of the strike, but the AL West wasn't competitive either. They had a subpar season, but in 1994, the strike loomed over the entire season, and ultimately the plug was pulled in early August. Baseball suffered a huge punch to the face in popularity in the wake of the 1994 strike, the 1995 lockout. When they came back in 1995, everyone's attendance was down. There was a big fight to get anyone in the stands. And the fact that the A's were not particularly a very good team, they weren't terrible, but they were not great in 1995. They still drew over 1 million fans, but baseball was really taking it on the chin. In the late 80s and early 90s, the A's had the second best attendance in the American League in 89 and 90, and were in the top 5 4 straight years. Now, post-strike and post-lockout, they were back to having terrible attendance in the wake of the animosity that took place with the work stoppages. But then Walter Haas did it. He did the thing that you're not supposed to do, but he did it anyway. And it's the sort of thing that's really, really hard to, overlook, and there's no way to reverse it. He died. Walter Haas died in 1995. And with the family looking over the team, they didn't want any part of it. This is Walter Haas's journey. This wasn't about his kids or anything like that. And before he died, the team was sold to Steve Schott and everyone, and that was that. And almost immediately, the cost cutting began, and the payroll was slashed. Remember, this was the owner as portrayed in Moneyball, who was not putting any money back into the team. And while Haas died, Al Davis didn't. And Al Davis, who tried his best to fleece Oakland in the early 80s before skedaddling to Los Angeles, now wanted a new deal from Los Angeles and threatened to skedaddle back to Oakland. And with his impending return, like Lenin on the train returning to Russia, Al Davis wanted the Oakland Coliseum basically refurbished for the Raiders. And for reasons that I never understood, the A's bent over backwards for the Raiders, or the city of Oakland bent over backwards for the Raiders. And with that came the construction of Mount Davis. And with that came the ugly, what looked like aircraft carrier that was built in straightaway center field with seats that were raked in such an incredible manner. I've sat up there. You can't see anything in a baseball game, and I imagine it's scary during a football game. And essentially ruined center field, put a monstrosity in straightaway center field, which used to be a beautiful hand-operated scoreboard and a beautiful green pasture and a view of the hills. All that's gone. And with that, the experience of going to an A's game fell into the toilet. And with that, any hope of making the experience of a fan-friendly experience in the Oakland Coliseum, sorry that I say experience twice in the same sentence, was gone. Also, the Giants were able to secure money to build, partially using public money for the infrastructure, but mainly private money to build the ballpark in China Basin. New ownership for the Giants kept them from moving to Florida, and they found the money to build a ballpark and to sign a superstar in Barry Bonds. Suddenly, the cool factor of Bay Area baseball shifted from the A's to the Giants. But while they built the ballpark in San Francisco, they maintained the territorial rights in San Jose. So when it became clear the Raiders bursting into the stadium and treating it like a bad tenant, throwing elbows around, the A's clearly needed a new ballpark. And with their eyes set right on San Jose, for the same reason why the Giants did earlier, it seemed like an ideal place to build a park, and beautiful renderings were made of Cisco Park. But the Giants, who didn't even have the same ownership, it was no longer the Haas family owning the A's, and the McGowan family were now running the Giants. So it wasn't even the same ownership that took place when the A's handed the territorial rights to the South Bay. But the Giants kept it, saying, no, you can't build a stadium there. We own the territorial rights. Territorial rights mean nothing. What is it, billboards? No, who looks at a billboard? I think I'll watch a Giants game today. You can watch A's games and Giants games in the South Bay. I know, I have. And if you're living in the South Bay, you're basically equidistant from Giants games to the A's games. The only value it has is keeping a team from building a stadium there, which would make sense if the A's were moving from another market. If the A's were just arriving from Kansas City, yeah, I can understand. Hey, you can't put a team there. We own that territorial rights. I get it. But do you know what? That's not the case. The A's have been there since before we landed on the moon. So the territorial rights being kept by the Giants is just a middle finger at this point. And if we had a commissioner, which we haven't had in well over a generation, probably since the A's won the World Series in 1989, they could have stepped in and said, work a deal out. Kind of like how they worked a deal out with the Expos moving to Washington, which was much more egregious than the A's potentially moving to San Jose. That was a team, the Expos were in Montreal. They weren't even in the same freaking country. And they moved in to the Beltway. Yeah, the Orioles had issues with that, and rightfully so. We've been using Washington as a big part of our fan base. You're going to put a team there, then you got to work out a deal with us. Now, if the Giants wanted something in return for them moving there, sure, work it out. But this could have been worked out 22 years ago, but it never was. So, let's review. The owner who loved the team, who put money into the team, and made the team the cool team that drew as well as any team in the American League, died. The A's had a chance to put a tremendous pitching staff together for the next generation, and they whiffed on every pick. The strike made people bitter about going to a baseball game in general. And by the time they came back, the stadium was ugly, unfriendly, and they couldn't move them because the A's didn't outrank the Raiders in terms of priorities by the Oakland Coliseum. And that's how we got to this place. And that's even before Fisher showed up. Now, someday, pretty soon, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the whole idea of Moneyball also helped sink the A's and get them in this situation. But those combination of events, just at the peak of the A's popularity and the peak of the A's power, all happened subtly under the surface. And then when we looked around, we said, oh no, what happened? Well, you didn't draw fans. It's more complicated than that. What Haas should have done at one point, especially when it was clear that the Giants were looking around, should have built a new ballpark. Should have built a new ball because there were no Raiders to contend with. Should have looked right over that corner in the parking lot. Somehow raise the money and build a ballpark for the A's only. And if you need to, have the Coliseum sit there right next to you and say, if Raiders want to return, there you go. Do what you want with it. But this is our place now. If that had happened in the early 90s, we're not having this conversation right now. So follow us at Locked On A's on Twitter or whatever it's called now. And on Instagram, I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. Doing an autopsy and figuring out the events of the 1990s that led to this. This has been Locked On A's. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully.